the question of how do you show up present as a performer for me is inseparable from how do I show up present in my life.
This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. I want to play something for you.
I'm just looking for a way around. It disappears this near. You're the run on water. I'm just looking for the divine hammer. One divine hammer. One divine hammer.
You're hearing Divine Hammer by The Breeders, as covered by my guest, Ben Lee. Ben was born in 1978, and like many musicians of his generation, was inspired by artists such as Sebadoh, Sonic Youth, and The Breeders to start a band of his own. Remarkably, that band, Noise Addict, came to the attention of many of their heroes almost immediately, sharing the bill with many of them in their native Australia. Ben began recording solo material at age 16, signing a deal with the Beastie Boys' Grand Royal Records and eventually moving to Los Angeles. Over the subsequent 25 years, Ben has released nearly 20 adventurous albums, exploring topics ranging from Islam to the practice of yoga to ayahuasca journeys. He even co-wrote a family-friendly musical about beer. Ben's latest effort, Quarter Century Classics, is an homage to the music that inspired him when he began his career. His tour kicks off today in Toronto. And now my conversation with Ben Lee.
It disappears this near. You're the right water.
I feel like Noise Addict was like, it was, I don't know, I guess a lot of things like that are like truly delusional in that I thought, like I had a Tascam 244, but I thought, the way it sounded in my head was like Appetite for Destruction or like Dark Side of the Moon or something. Like I thought we were making super hi-fi rock.
Right.
And lo-fi, it hadn't even registered with me. It was accidentally.
And it wasn't the ambition, and it wasn't how charming
not.
That we're little kids.
No, we wanted to be badasses. And so it was delusional.
That's interesting because I think every musician is delusional at some point, especially early on. I mean, I can remember the first couple times that I played with a guitar player who was just a friend of mine that lived up the street when I was 11. The amount of joy that I felt in that moment has rarely been equaled, no matter, if I played in front of thousands of people or, done bigger things or actually become competent as a musician. And so the interesting thing about Noise Addict is that, most people have that delusion when they're starting, but yours was actually released into the world.
I reckon, like, in a way, something I realized kind of recently is I think we all have a superpower in a sense, and it's different for everybody. Like, I've just met you, but I've listened to enough of your podcasts, and the way you listen and the insightful questions you ask, these are like superpowers. Not everyone has these kind of things. Not to diminish, I know you're also a musician, but I'm saying we all have gifts that other people don't have. And I kind of realized that, like, I have this gift of going for it in whatever I'm doing. And it's not always cool. It doesn't always work. It's not always even good, but I always go for it 100%. And there's like a chutzpah in that is charming and is inspiring to people, I think, in some ways. Like,
yeah, and at the core of the superpower of going for it, there has to be some sort of belief in self.
It's weird, though, because it's often through not thinking it through. Mm-hmm. So it's not like a deep belief often. It's like foolhardiness. Like, I'm definitely the jump and then see how big the fall is type thing. Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people who will take the risk before calculating the possible damage. I'm getting less like that as I get older.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much deep belief you have in that to do that, to take a risk. In some forms, some ways it's a form of insanity more than deep belief. I don't know.
Maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know. I think I had that feeling of going for it early on. I started playing in bands and playing shows and stuff when I was pretty young too.
Yeah.
But then at some point, maybe by the time I was in my late teenage years, I was very self-critical. Like that voice became dominant. And now I'm actually kind of skewing back towards just going for it.
Yeah, man. Well, that's what's interesting, because I went through a bit of a similar relationship in terms of ambition, where I was incredibly ambitious, but it was very like from my ego. Like it was really like, I want attention. I want to be a famous band or whatever, And then I got like really wounded by the inevitable outcome of that type of ambition, because win or lose, that's not a nice healing place to have your center in. You know what I mean? So you're going to be bound for heartbreak and disappointment. But more recently, I'm 41 now, I'm finding this massive surge of ambition coming back, but in a really different way. It's almost like just the desire to make beautiful things.
Yes.
And like really do it, like not for the credit of it. And look, credit's nice and we all like making money and all that, but like going, wow, what if I set myself a really difficult goal? The beauty of like fulfilling that and manifesting it. It's like a different type of ambition, I think.
Yeah, it's almost like I don't have children, but I think of it as like this podcast is a child of mine. I want it to have a life of its own outside of me. It's not driven by my ego. I want the podcast to be interacting with people throughout the world and doing something. And similarly with this album I just made, I just want it to have a life of its own, and I want it to be self-sustaining in some way. That's the ambition now. It's not because I want attention. I mean, maybe in a deep-seated way it is.
I mean, it never goes away.
I mean, it might all like come back to the fact that we all know we're going to die, and we want to distract from that as much as possible. So who knows?
And
That's
look, if
the
you do
ego.
anything freelance, we all like it when the phone's ringing more than when it's not. When people are like, hey, you want to be part of something is fun. It's more fun.
Yeah, and incidentally, the reason why I'm able to take that more kind of Zen tact now is because my phone is ringing, right. So now I'm like, okay, so maybe like the baseline amount of attention that I require is already satisfied.
Yes, in the Maslow's hierarchy, you've like met a minimum or something. And I feel the same, actually. I always felt like I don't need everyone to, like, really in my heart, like as a musician, like I don't need everyone to love what I do. It's not like, I think there are certain personalities, like, probably like the
Michael
Oasis
Jackson.
guys or Michael Jackson or Taylor Swift, who it's like an all or nothing game. For me, I do like knowing my work is meaningful, but I'm quite happy with that being a passionate subsection of the larger culture. I always thought the dream is to be just successful enough so that like you're not worried about money and you've got artistic freedom, but no one's bothering you. I mean, once you add in that layer of, and I've had that a bit in Australia, like that pop stardom thing, it doesn't help. It's not like really something that makes your creative process much better.
No, I think it could probably hurt.
Yeah.
Well, let's kind of go back. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Sydney. Yeah.
And what did your parents do?
My mum was in, basically, my parents were a bit older when they had me. I had two older sisters. By the time I came around, my mum was working in essentially a multicultural health. So things like how do you convey health information to different communities that might be non-English speaking or Aboriginal communities, and how do you get information about vaccinations or alcoholism or, basic health and safety to different cultures within Australia, which is pretty interesting work. And my dad worked in local government. So he was it's basically sort of a city councillor, but in Australia, it's sort of like a volunteer job. It's not. I even think in the US that has a degree of like feeling like there's like an affluence or something to it, but it's much more like in Australia, it's more traditionally like almost like there's a stipend, but it's basically community volunteer work. And my dad also had some businesses and things, but yeah, that was sort of their basic passions in a way.
How much older were your sisters?
15 and 18 years older.
How is that possible? Is it different mothers?
No, it's the same. It was basically like my mum was a really young mum when she had that. Like she had her first kid at 19. Mm-hmm. So then by the time it got to me, whatever
she was 37. Yeah.
Yeah, so and she was going back to university, and she was almost finished university actually to sort of start this next phase of her life. And they'd been talking about, should we try for one more and have a son? And because there's two girls, and they just gave it one more shot, At least that's the story. That's the story they tell.
No wonder you like to go for it.
It's also why I think I like women. I've always felt really comfortable with women. I think growing up with two sisters, they never seemed like a foreign species to me. And I've ultimately had like probably more collaborations with women than men. Like I feel very comfortable around them. And also why I think I started work young. I was 14 when I started a band and touring and everything because I was around adults all the time. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like our house was not geared towards a child's experience. It was like sitting at dinner tables with older teenagers and, adults talking about ideas. So there was probably a bit of a somewhat unnatural acceleration in the sense of what I expected of myself or the impact I should have or the way my mind was working.
What kind of music was on in your house?
My parents liked John Denver, Peter, Paul and Mary, like music that's actually like kind of a no-brainer for why I ended up playing like acoustic music essentially. Because in Australia, I would say like the 60s happened in the 70s. Like as far as social change stuff, it's just a little bit, it all happened a little bit later. So my parents really didn't participate in like a cultural revolution. Being in the 60s in Australia was still, they kind of grew up in a much more sort of conservative landscape. So there wasn't like a lot of like kind of rock and roll in a way. My sisters had, I always remember their record collection because I didn't listen to the records as much as I would go through the records and look at the covers. And the two that left this sort of indelible imprint on me were Roxy Music Avalon and Fleetwood Mac Rumours, which were probably records that every teenager had in that period. But the covers were so weird. Like to me, the mystery of what was going on the cover of Avalon or Rumours almost equated to like my bewilderment at what sex would be from like a little kid's perspective.
You can already feel that there's something mysterious and sexual about it, even though you don't have any handle over your own sexuality at the time.
And the music didn't even matter. It was kind of like, what the hell are these things? Mm-hmm. So that's sort of what I remember in that sense. But there's music in our family. Like my grandmother is the youngest of 20 children and the only girl. And she grew up in agricultural Russia, like coming up to the Industrial Revolution. And one of her older brothers was the court violinist for Tsar Nicholas in Russia. And another one was a gypsy violinist called Sasha Berliner, who lived in Berlin in the 20s and hung out with Einstein. It was like fascinating, all her stories about, because she went to stay with him for a bit. But I found these reviews in the Australian newspapers when he came out from Berlin and played this gypsy music. And they were like, it's the real troubadour tradition. And he stands on people's tables and gets in their faces. I was like, that's me. I was
so
like, that
strange.
That weird Russian kind of like punk intense, like my wife always, like when I sneeze or when I talk really loud or gesticulate wildly, she's always like, oh, you just have this like Russian energy of just, and I feel that in my family, it's in the music, the sort of like a kind of intensity. So it was sort of in there, it was like in the blood. But when they came out to Australia, all that side of my grandmother's family, it all switched into this immigrant mentality of creating opportunity for the kids and opening a factory and paying for universities. And so the music thing, it got kind of like suppressed. And it became, you have to do piano lessons after school. And, a much more sort of like, it's just well-rounded to play music and all
Right.
that. Not the idea that you would become a professional musician or a gypsy.
Right.
Or
It's a
troubadour.
supplement to your eventual career and
exactly.
being a cultured member of society.
You should speak a language.
Yeah,
Like those
like
kind
Russian,
of things.
but not Russian.
Yeah. It was just seen as that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think it really the idea that I felt it so deeply and became a musician kind of caught my family off guard in that way.
What did your sisters end up doing?
One of them went into like social work and that sort of thing. And the other one went into law and became a domestic violence defender, sort of public defender. Yeah.
And when you were growing up, was your life structured in that way? I mean, were you expected to take piano lessons and learn a language?
Not really. I mean, my grandmother sat me down when I was, I think, 8 and said, I really think you should start piano. It's very important. And I said, I don't know if I'm going to be into it. She's like, to become well-rounded, you should play piano. So I did it for 2 years. And I did like it. I liked it, but I didn't practice much and stuff.
Yeah.
And I call it the mandatory Jewish 2 years of piano. It's like most Jewish kids grow up in at least in 2 years of piano. But then I had Smash Hits magazine, and it had a competition to win an electric guitar in it. And I wanted that guitar so badly. I entered the competition, and this is a good example of like delusion. I became convinced I was going to win this guitar, and that was going to be my ticket out of playing piano. I could be like, hey, look, I'm going to switch to guitar because I won a guitar. Mm-hmm. And of course, I never won the guitar.
I was getting ready to hear that you did win it. That your delusion.
You never
sometimes,
win.
but sometimes the people that are real delusional thinkers actually, the delusion has a causal effect on reality.
I would say for me, the delusion became like a dream symbol that I could say, my desire to play guitar manifests in a form of delusion to win a guitar.
Yes.
But what I realized when I didn't win the guitar, I was like, I want to play guitar. And that was the shift into my own musical journey. I was about 10. And it was.
So you got a guitar when you were 10?
Yeah, I got actually my sisters one of them had a guitar. So I started on that and then bought a very cheap acoustic and just got into it.
Did you start playing it on your own? Or take lessons?
Yeah, there was a guitar shop sort of pretty nearby, and they had lessons out the back, so I'd go out the back. But interestingly, like, I do think there are different kinds of musicians, and I try not to. It's funny, I did this gig with John Bryan recently, and he was talking about his own feeling of inferiority because he plays so many instruments. Mm-hmm. He said, I've seen a lot of my peers excel much further on one instrument because they stick to it. And he said, but I never, and I was like, dude, your idea of like not excelling is still better than like anyone I know. Like he's an incredible drummer, incredible,
Yeah.
But I do think there are, and perhaps we do always feel inferior, but I was never the kind of musician that wanted to sit and perfect technique. From day one, my goal was to learn the chords needed to write songs. Mm-hmm. I just was very clear about that. I wanted to be able to write songs, and those were the skills. And since then, technique inevitably comes and evolves, and you start learning little things. But it was always in service of song from day one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think some people have a relationship with technique wherein it almost helps them avoid having to write songs. It's almost like if you were a poet and you spent all of your time learning new vocabulary so that you didn't have to actually face yourself and put your feelings down on the page.
That might be true, but that's also, it's like pitting the approaches against each other. Whereas as someone that writes songs, I'm thrilled there are musicians that are amazing enough that don't write songs because they want to play with me and play on my records. Yeah. It's the skill set I can bring that not everyone has.
Yeah, and the two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. No. But especially as a drummer, I think there are lots of drummers that approach it more athletically than on other instruments for some reason. Perhaps because drums are so much more athletic innately than other instruments.
And probably with drums, there's a much smaller segment of drummers that are also songwriters than there are guitar players. Right. That's something you can very much divide.
You also have to kind of be at least a competent drummer to be worthwhile.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Like,
that's true.
I mean, even I would argue, the drummer from the Shags, which is a weird band, has something going on.
Well, that's what I meant. It was well done. Just
Yeah.
back to the Shags. Everyone was kind of in their weird structures and timings. They were actually playing their parts.
Yeah.
And with commitment and kind of precision.
Yeah.
too.
I think it can be charming when a guitar player is very sloppy, but there's only a few drummers that can be that sloppy and still serve the band.
I think there's also, coming back to the middle passage and that interview. Remind me his name, the drummer
Steve
from
Gorman.
Black Rose.
Yeah.
Steve, I was saying I loved that interview. After I read that book, and it made me think about kind of a theory I've had in my head the whole time that say Bob Dylan records, I've kind of often appreciated subsequent albums when I pass through the life stages that he passed through when he wrote them.
Yes.
Like the 20-year-old me had no interest in Slow Train Coming or Oh Mercy or, some of these later records. But when I got into my 30s and then into my 40s, I'm like, oh, these records kind of I get it a little more. And I think it's very easy when you're young to be, it's kind of like that year zero punk mentality. Like nothing matters except the raw thing that starts now and people show up now. And then you realize life has stages to it. And you start to realize that someone in their 40s playing with no technique or competence, it's not quite as charming.
No, it's definitely not.
It is charming when you're 15.
Sure.
It is charming when you're 20 and you can get up maybe up to 25. After that, you become people look at you okay, I like it, but there's something wrong with this person. There's mentally something unsound that they haven't mastered the basic technique.
I think the thing that's charming about it is that it's this relationship between exuberance and good ideas and then limited vocabulary with which to express it can be really exciting.
That's true.
But then, after another couple decades, there isn't really as much of an excuse to have those limitations.
Yeah.
And then it becomes manufactured.
Well, it's also misunderstood. I think sometimes when people work with more wild gifts, I'm thinking of, I did a few gigs a couple years ago with Daniel Johnston, right?
Sure.
And he reminded me of seeing Iggy Pop. The moment when he got to the microphone, he delivered. I don't know what else was going on in his psyche or with his health or his emotional stability or instability, but there was a commitment and precision and valuing of what that moment meant when he sang. And he sang his ass off and he sang beautifully and he was present, and it reminded me of stories you'd hear about Iggy just being in total chaos. But at that moment when he got to the mic, it was he was there doing that thing. And I think people misunderstand some of these artists and think that they're sort of savants who don't know what they're doing or something. It's more just the area of their expertise has become incredibly narrow, but very focused. Daniel Johnston, my feeling was that he had mastered a certain type of presence and delivery within a certain style of music and writing. It was not the ramblings of a madman. It was someone that had made many sacrifices and had kind of not conformed to the expectations of society. But as far as the level they held themselves to in writing and performing, it was very, very high.
Yeah.
So I just think people misanalyze punk and sort of sometimes what we call outsider art or sloppy stuff.
Sure.
And it's you don't realize how hard people are working to actually be in the energy that they want to be in to deliver that work,
Right.
It may sound stupid when I say it out loud, like I'm just jealous of his silver cloud. He looks real good, he drinks Diet Coke, he gets his enemies sent by air, not boat. I wish I was him, he gets the women at his feet. With all his cool friends, he gets his records for free. I wish I was him, he has no enemies. I wish I was him. He's got 6 different flannel shirts, airwalks, not thongs.
How do you put yourself into the energy that you want to be in?
Yeah, well, I had a realization at some point because like as a solo artist, touring can be kind of expensive because you're hiring people to play. It's not a band thing where like, hey, we're all in it together, get in the van.
Right.
There's no way for me to go out on tour with a full band and have it be. It's rarely profitable. Like in Australia, it's profitable for me, so I can do it, but. Anywhere else it costs me money, So I realized at a certain point, I was like, okay, I need to like give up the expectation that I'm going to deliver records as they sound. And I've got to like show up in various combinations of, with one person, by myself, with two people, using the support band as a backing band, doing, I just opened my mind up. And what I realized by doing that was my audience could not care less in what form I deliver the music. My audience comes to the show for me to show up present as myself with my sense of humor and my outlook and my gifts, whatever they are, and to sing songs and talk to them. And it kind of like, it gave me a sense of perspective because I do think, there's a type of compromise that happens by like, well, what does the industry want for you? I don't like that type of thing, but I do like the way life forms you and refines you through experience and failure and success. And you go, how can I serve best? Basically, like, what are my gifts? What do people want from me? How can I bring the goods in a way that's meaningful in my community? And I just realized, like, it's kind of me showing up with a guitar and being willing to be present in that experience. Beyond that, I'm not someone who the audience feels like, I need to hear this song or that song, or I need to hear this solo. That's not the type of career I have. People want to check in and see what I'm up to and what the vibe is. And so that's kind of, I just really try and show up and be present.
How do you get present?
The question of how do you show up present as a performer for me is inseparable from how do I show up present in my life. I don't, and this I think also comes from punk and indie music, that like, the separation is very thin. I've never had that mentality of like, I have a persona on stage and then there's the real me that my audience doesn't know. Like, I feel like if you've listened to a few of my records, you probably do know me actually pretty well, because with whatever insight or lack of insight I've had at that time of my life, I put it in the record. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like how I stay present as a human being, I don't have an answer to that. It's more ruling things out as I go through life. I know that it's certainly not about any dogmatic rituals or practices. I've done those things like regular meditation practices and chanting and yoga and all that, and I find it might just be the way my mind works, but I'm prone to getting caught in new types of prisons as I become habitual or dogmatic with things. So for me, a lot of like parenting is the same thing. Like, how do I show up, or in my marriage, like being present to those things? It's kind of about treating each moment as a new thing, and I'm not sure there's a prescription for that. It's
About cannabis.
Yeah, well, I mean, and psychedelics,
yeah,
those are all
that'll
things that help, but I'm very careful not to be prescriptive, because just in
Sure.
my past experience, I found that everything is true and its opposite is also true. And so you end up like, you end up saying something works,
Right.
and then it ends up like actually doing the opposite of working at a certain point, or you're
Sure.
like, so
Yeah, psychedelics work, and also sobriety works.
Yeah,
Like, yes.
exactly. It's very personal. And I heard someone say, I really love this. It's funny. I think it was like the showrunner for Modern Family or something on some podcast. It was one of those ones. That's why I love podcasts, because I listen to people's minds who I wouldn't have had the opportunity or been open to before. But he said he doesn't like when people ask him for advice about success in show business, because he said the thing about success in show business is it's like chopping your way through a jungle with a machete, and as you take a new step, the path closes behind you so no one can follow. And I feel like it's the same, like in terms of spiritual or psychological, or like the quest for happiness. You cannot imitate anyone else's path. It just doesn't work. You have to find your own relationship to who you are and what your mission is personally.
Was Judaism like a big part of your life growing up? Did you feel a connection spiritually to what you were doing?
I didn't feel a connection to like the rituals or the language or the particular mythology. I did feel a connection to the type of questioning and debate and like rigorous intellectual struggle that is part of Jewish culture. You know, it's like the Jewish religion at its best is like people tearing apart ideas and almost like instead of becoming like encased within dogma, looking for the flaws in their own logic and letting it trouble them and getting other people's input. And, you know, there's...
What's the term for that again?
Well, there's the Talmud, which is like the oral history, I guess, of like debate. And so it's... But maybe there's another term you're thinking of. But the Buddhists have that too. You know, there's this kind of like debate. I've loved always talking about ideas, and I think that is sort of innately Jewish in some ways, a certain way of talking about them. But it's more that like I went to a Jewish school my whole life, so I did feel kind of like it was a space to start thinking about things. But I always had a reaction against orthodoxy. It seemed scared and uptight. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I say that with, it's not, I don't have a rage about that. It's just my impression. I hope I meet Orthodox people in any religion who don't exhibit those tendencies. To me, the way it appeared to me was that it was not the most sort of creative way of living. So even though I continued to like look for answers in a way, that's been part of my journey. I had also had a wariness of being told what the truth was. Like I wanted to experience it for myself. Mm-hmm. I guess that's why why I've been kind of like a seeker, both like musically and in my life and spiritually, is because like I've wanted to try things. Like I don't just want to read books about them. I want to like live things out and see what the feeling's like.
Yeah, and then right around the time when you're bar mitzvah, Noise Addict is a band.
Yeah. And that was, I saw Nirvana play at the Big Day Out in 92. So that was 4 months after my bar mitzvah. So it was like I was just...
Did you get a guitar for your bar mitzvah?
Yeah. I got money from my parents' friends and grandparents' friends, and I bought a guitar.
What did you get?
I bought a Les Paul.
Nice.
But it's so funny because it's like, it was so heavy. And I was like a little dude. I mean, I'm still a little dude, but I hadn't had a growth spurt yet.
Yeah.
It was a really heavy guitar. I probably got it because like Slash played one or something.
And then you see Kurt with his Fender... A few months later.
Exactly. My next guitar, I think, was a Mustang. Noise Addict, the whole thing, seeing Nirvana, there was like a...
that was the Nevermind tour.
Yeah. It was right, it was January 92.
So they were just about to explode.
Yeah, so what had happened was the guy who actually ended up discovering Noise Addict, he was a local promoter called Steve Pav, who went on to like, he kind of discovered like Tame Impala, Wolf Mother, The Presets, like a lot of Australian... sort of luminaries. Like he was a very kind of tastemaker guy, you know. Mm-hmm. He had written Nirvana a fan letter. I guess Mudhoney or Sonic Youth or one of the other bands he'd toured said, you got to check out this band. So he wrote to them around Bleach. And they booked this tour I think it was 2 weeks after Nevermind came out without any idea of what would happen. So they ended up playing the Big Day Out. And it was just a wild moment because I think they'd gone to #1 in America and they were in this Australian tour and... it was just an electric... They were supporting the Violent Femmes.
My hometown band.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I love them. It was epic. And to me, I'd been to like local punk shows and stuff and like Sydney indie rock, but I'd never seen a show on that scale, like just literally how big the venue was, being held by like... There was no light show. There were no theatrics. There was just 3 guys standing on stage playing their songs. And the simplicity of that... to me was almost where like I just downloaded the possibilities of indie rock and punk. It was just kind of like, oh, you just get people you know and you write songs and you play them. It was so simple. And there was no glass ceiling to it suddenly. It wasn't like you'll only be able to play the youth center or the local pub. It was like you could also be the biggest band in the world. Like it was just a trippy moment to kind of be getting into music. And formed Noise Addict pretty much like the next week after that show. And it all happened kind of quickly from there in a way.
Right. So then somebody discovered you.
Yeah,
The same
so-
guy that booked that gig.
Yeah, so I said my dad was on the local council, so he, we were looking for gigs. He said, well, the local library is having a sausage sizzle and a book sale. It's like a barbecue and a book sale
Yeah.
to raise money. He's like, do you want me to ask if you can play at it? And I was like, yeah, sure, we need a gig. So we played at it. So we'd made these demos, and I opened up the local street press. So it was like we had two. We had On the Street and Drum Media, and they were sort of like LA Weekly, Village Voice type things. And there was an article in it said how to make a demo and what to do with it. So I just followed it step by step. It said, get all the records you like, copy down the addresses of the record labels on the back, write a thing called a bio, take photos. So we did like 3 photos standing up against a wall with graffiti on it. We were little kids. And sent it off to labels. And then it said, call them a week later, ask them if they received it, call them back a week after that, ask them if they... I just followed this down to a T. And I remember calling Waterfront Records, which was like the cool record store in Sydney. And I said, hi, this is Ben from Noise Addict. Have you guys had a chance to listen to our demo? And this voice came back and goes, Ben, your tape stood out like dog's balls. And from that moment, that guy, Steven Stavrakis, sent this other guy, Pav, to see us play at the Sausage Sizzle. And he came up to us after and said, he's like, I love your band. You want to support Sonic Youth? And that was kind of the beginning of our career, really. It was very weird.
And did you know about Sonic Youth at the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really learning about punk and indie music, and I was listening to Fugazi and Sonic Youth, and and then it was like Sebadoh and Pavement and the kind of current younger wave of music coming out, and Liz Phair and that
Matador,
kind of thing.
yeah.
all
So you
that
started
stuff.
with Nirvana on Geffen, and then of course Sonic Youth was on the label at the time.
I'm sure
VGC.
so
Then
many
you go
people of
back.
my generation, it was like
Sure.
Nirvana were like this entry point.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember even their B-sides album, Incesticide, they had a whole list of bands that you're supposed to check out.
Yeah. And that's, I think how old are you?
I am 39.
Okay, so we're pretty much the same age. I think part of what we've grown up with in indie music is the idea that with platform comes the obligation to create exposure for other people. That's what we saw Nirvana do, and then Sonic Youth and the Beastie Boys and these artists it was not like a platform it was a privilege. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that would be, and if you're given that, you introduce people to other cool things going on. It's just sort of what you do. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, part of what I've always loved about collaboration, that there's this sort of passing the torch or hipping audiences to different things that is super exciting, about curating stuff, whether it's a podcast or an album or kind of turning people onto things that they wouldn't know about is just part of the way I think our generation understood what it meant to have exposure.
Yeah, and I think also similar to your story, when I was 14, I also had a Tascam cassette 4-track, and I was in bands and I was playing shows, and it would have been a dream come true to support Sonic Youth, but that just never happened for us. So what was your mentality? What was your mindset when this was happening? You didn't really have much of a frame of reference to compare it to.
Yeah.
And you hadn't failed for years before finally getting an opportunity.
Yeah.
How did it feel?
Well, it's something I've thought a lot about, because failure and challenge and paying your dues, they all happen for everyone if you complete the path of being an artist, right? So it's I'm interested in lifetime artists and what they've been through. And there is no one in their 70s or 80s who you sit down with who hasn't been through every single experience.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it is interesting when you do that, the paying your dues part. Certainly for me, it was not at the beginning. And that created opportunities and problems. I think when you don't know anything else. I mean, I remember my friend, do you know Lara Mayaratkin? I thought you might know her. She made music with me for years, but she's she scores stuff with Craig Wedren.
Oh, yeah, I do know Lara.
You know Lara?
Yes, I do. Yeah, of course I do.
So
She works
she's
on
like-
Glow, and she
Yeah,
just had
yeah.
a baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just didn't remember her last name.
Well, also, it's a out of
and
context.
Craig and I scored a movie together as well.
So
yeah.
me and Lara are like godparents to each other's kids. She's like one of my best friends. So she played with me for years and made tons of records with me and stuff. I remember she knew the guys from Arcade Fire, and she was talking about when that first record came out. She bumped into them somewhere, and she was like, "Are you guys totally overwhelmed? Like, this has been an amazing ride." And they were saying, "This is the experience we've had. This is what we sort of think it's like," And it's funny. It's like, but that is what happens when you get breaks quickly, especially when you're young and you haven't built up cynicism or anything. You go, okay,
This is how it goes.
This is happening. This is what's
Yeah.
happening. I think one of the interesting sort of predicaments philosophically that was created for me was I was actually a generation younger than people like Thurston Moore and Mike D and Lou Barlow and Stephen Malkmus and Ian Mackay and these people that I was sort of like becoming peers with. But naturally, my value system and aesthetic and everything was a step. It was like a generation later. Like I didn't come up through 80s hardcore. So I came up through 90s indie rock. So it's one of the things was I felt always a bit trapped between worlds, that in a way, by the time I got into my 20s, I was looked at a little bit as like a veteran of another time when I was actually the same age. Like I remember when the Strokes came up and I was like, I'm pretty much the same age as the Strokes.
Right.
But I was from an era before. So I was a little bit like trapped between worlds. And in some ways, that's sort of been good for me because it's led to me not being able to, even if I wanted to, fully conform to the mindset or creative culture of any particular scene or generation. But yeah, it was a very unique.
Were
thing.
you experiencing joy when you were opening for Sonic Youth and playing these gigs, opening for Fugazi?
I mean, joy is like, it's when you're hungry, you know what I mean? Like when you start and you're hungry, like you got to imagine, because look, my wife's the same. Like she started working at 15 or 16.
And your wife is an actor.
Yeah, Ione Sky. So
Yeah.
she was in, like when she was 15, she was in River's Edge and then Say Anything.
Right.
Like, cool films.
And then your father-in-law is Donovan.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah.
but particularly with me and Ione, because we both started young, whenever you see people starting young with hunger to change their lives, there's some dissatisfaction going on with what they're being given.
All right, let's go with that. So
Yeah,
where
yeah.
was that discontent coming from in your life as far as how the world was being presented to you?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to family a lot of the time. I think I am much more innately experimental than my family. I think my family are wonderful people who are have always been looking to like live correctly in whatever that vision is. I have a more playful attitude to, it's even to meaning. Like I don't really like ascribe absolute meaning to things. I see it all as this sort of shifting, kind of slippery world. I mean, that's how artists think. You know what I mean? I think creative people realize the meaning is there because we ascribe it.
Yes.
And symbols can be played with, and it's a dance. There's a dance element to it that, for me, why I love creative people is there's an awareness that we're in a game, and that art is a game. And we're rolling the dice each time. And, we're gamblers too, and we're willing to take the risk, and we don't. It's
not willing.
Yeah,
I crave it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I was like, I remember me and my wife built a house and sold it.
I need to talk to you about that because I want to build a house.
Okay, yeah. So we did it, and we did it as an investment, right?
Yeah.
And the real estate agent was like, "Do you have the stomach for this?" Because it's pretty intense because you put money into something and it might not work or it might.
Yeah, it's like, that's my entire life.
Yeah, I was like, dude, we're artists. We don't know what's happening tomorrow. I've done at times put 6 months of work into a project that has disappeared into the ether, never to be heard from again. I can handle failure, So I think that mindset, as I get older, I try not to think in terms of like, like having like a strict idea of like, oh, because they were conservative, it wounded me or something like that. It's just like sensibility wise, like
It was different.
I wanted to roll the dice. You know what I mean? Like to me, the fun of life was connected to risk. And I think when you're born into a world where there are other worlds I could have been born into where that would have been reflected back at me as a positive attribute. For instance, I've done this project over the last decade with the author Tom Robbins, and because I didn't have any artists in my family, I've really valued this transgenerational, like he's 88, and I'm looking at someone at the end of their career who has maintained a sense of playfulness and experimentation and not trying to grip too tightly and realizing like, oh, this is a path. You know what I mean? It wasn't presented as a path. All that was presented as a path to me was, do you want to be a lawyer? Do you want to go into business? Do you want to, and like, I just realized like, for whatever reason, part of my journey was to fight out of conservatism into freedom as I needed to experience it.
So how did it work when you were touring as a 14-year-old? Would your parents go with you?
Yeah, my dad would pretty much go. I was only allowed to go on weekends. So like we would go, I remember like Fugazi did a tour in Melbourne. We went down to Melbourne, did Friday, Saturday, Sunday night. Alex Chilton, I'd played with him at Maxwell's in New Jersey. He came to Australia and asked me to open for him, but it was a school night, so I couldn't do it. But in some ways that was kind of cool because even though it's a totally artificial construct, like who really cares if I'd been tired to go to school the day after playing with Alex Chilton? What it did was it gave me the courage to say no a little bit. Like my parents just going...
That's something I've been thinking about a lot.
Dude,
yes.
It's so intense. And one of the things I'm sure you've felt in this town, as you sort of see like how show business is like, it's just one big circus, that like the power to say no is the most powerful negotiating tool you can possibly have, and your value goes up as soon as you feel comfortable saying no to stuff. So some of these lessons that like frustrated me at the time, and that's probably what good parenting should do. It frustrates you at the time, but later you go, that was pretty cool.
Right.
And that was something that was pretty cool. In a way, it was built on an archaic adherence to the school system, which my parents had. But in a larger sense, it just taught me like life doesn't begin and end with every opportunity that you're given.
You have a life and a structure, and this needs to fit into that.
Exactly. And then, when I was, but then it was sort of appropriately. But then when I got to like 15, 16, I would come in my school holidays to the US and tour. I made a record. My first solo record I made in Chicago at IDFUL with Brad Wood. So that was always like in school holidays. And we'd tour, Noise Addict would tour the US during Christmas break. It was very much and I think one of the cool things about that I didn't like throw out school, even though it wasn't really in the cards for me to go to university, I decided that when I was 18, not when I was 14.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like I kind of played along and I did pretty well in school and everything. And then...
So that it was an actual option.
It was a real option. Like had I gone, there are people like, I don't know, like even like Rivers Cuomo. Like
sure.
They have something unfulfilled that they feel they didn't get to really choose to live out and they have to go back to school and do it. I felt like I really like, by the time it came to make that decision, I was like, yeah, it's music. Music's happening. I've been doing this already for 4 years. And I'm going to make a proper choice and do this. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
So then what was your next step? Did you move here?
No, I didn't move until I was 18. So when I finished 12th grade.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So you moved here when you were 18?
Yeah, well, I had a little momentum then because I was on Grand Royal and I had an audience. This is what was interesting. The level of my career I was at, it was actually pretty small, but proportionally within the US, there was opportunity. Like I was maybe selling like 35,000 copies of my solo records in the US, which is not.
I mean, I was aware of it as an indie kid. In
and
the
CMJ
90s.
played it.
Sure.
But in Australia, I was selling less than 1,000 copies.
Oh, wow.
Which proportionally is equal.
Yeah.
We only have 20 million people. But you're not going to start a career with an audience of 800 people spread around the country.
Right.
So it made sense for me to come to America. And I kind of I just went for it.
When I was a kid, I was best at whatever I did. When I was a kid, I was smart at the top of the class. When I was a lad, I was sure I had the world in my hands. I was my own teacher, I had my own plan. I could have been an athlete, could have trained all the time, been just like the others, could have left them behind. But I was too lazy, I could not see ahead.
I didn't have a plan. I came, I made another record in LA, and that was a record like Anna and Petra and Tanya played on.
The Haydens.
Yeah, the Haydens and Anna from That Dog. And I sort of, and it's funnily, that first trip, it was really interesting because I was 18. I didn't really have a plan. I ended up meeting my wife, Ione, on that trip 10 years before we ever went on a date. It sort of was like the universe did sort of like open up to me a little bit and all these things started happening. And enough that I could just kind of keep it going. I did some touring and I toured with Cat Power and interesting people, and then I ended up like moving to New York and I was becoming an artist. I was beginning to live like an artist,
Were you supporting yourself with the art?
Yeah, I was. It was a little funny because that was actually the first dip after my initial sort of like debutante ball in indie rock, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I made this very folky record, which is quite funny. I've been thinking about it a lot because I got really into like Loudon Wainwright and, folk music. But at 18 years old, you cannot carry that pose. It's like, there are certain people like Dylan who are such good actors that he could portray himself, or Tom Waits, as this old, wizened
I feel like
person.
Dylan is finally the artist that he was
pretending
pretending to be. Yeah.
I never was able to convincingly. So I sort of like, in a way, that's where I sort of experienced the dip of people just going like, that was the first time people were like, and it's getting good. But I also started like partying and having fun and like collaborating with people and realizing, life continues to open even if you're not like the hip guy on the block, and then, in my career, I've had, I'd say 3 or 4 ups and downs type big, major moments where like I'd have like a hit song in Australia or in Europe and it's like, you go, oh, okay. Like we said, the phone's ringing again and and then it dives again. And then it's, and now they've changed shape because I'm not necessarily looking for like that kind of rock and roll acceptance now, but then I like scored an HBO show and then I've got this musical and it's sort of like things are happening or I produce other artists and it's like you feel like your skill set is appreciated or respected or there's some demand for it, and it's an interesting journey just going through it. And I feel like each time I go through it, it's almost like they take a sword, the old style of sword making. I always remember this, where they would go like coal and ice, like, fire burning coal, I mean. So like, it was kind of like to make something really strong, you have to put it through these extremes. And I think being an artist is the same. You have to go through like people kissing your ass and telling you like, oh my God, everything you do is amazing, to then being like a leper and being like in show business jail and being like, no interest in you. And then back and you kind of, each time you refine yourself and you go, oh, neither of these are real.
Especially when you come back out of it. So tell me about the first like major dip when you felt like a leper.
I remember when I made that record in LA, Something to Remember Me By, I just didn't feel, it's weird. You start developing this, show business is weird. You get this like sixth sense for just buzz, and you make some things that have a good buzz about them. I don't even mean just people talking. There's just like an energy to it. Like you can feel people are wishing something well. And then there's other things that like people have no interest in. And it was the first time I just felt, and I remember I got quite depressed about it because I felt like I was maturing and my vision was maturing and people wanted me to stay this like indie kid, like writing these like cute, heartbreaking kind of things. And I wanted to be more like wizened and hardened. And,
you were essentially trying to do the same thing that child actors that break
Yeah.
out, like a Ron Howard or Justin Timberlake. What people that have a brand built around them being young and naive and then trying to actually become an adult person.
But I think people who do that really well, for me, it's been a long process. Like
Yeah.
I'm now 27 years into my career and I feel like I'm now spoken to as an adult and my skill set is respected as an adult. But I think there are smarter people than me who transition their careers with more elegance. And probably they have smarter people guiding them and they accept the advice a little more. Have never been like that. Like I said, I'm a find out for yourself type person. So I have done some things. I've been someone unafraid of like sudden changes where I didn't necessarily take care of bringing my audience with me. And I think that's one of the things. I have a very I remember I did a tour with Dashboard Confessional. And that guy, Chris, we were talking about, we were applauding each other as opposed to, I was saying to him, I really like how you've brought your audience with you. Like their place in your heart and in your mythology is they know it. They know they're important to you. I've been more the kind of artist who looked at my audience and thought, okay, now I'm going to trick you and surprise you and give you something that's going to maybe offend you even. And I think that's been to the detriment of for instance, just the continuity of growth in my career. I'm someone who, but then there's the flip side of it, that the moves you make that are unpredictable or that are weird are actually the ones that stop people fucking with you. Mm-hmm. So I've never been told by a label, can we hear some demos? Because there's been an assumption that I'm doing my own thing. So it's kind of a catch-22. The path I've taken has been very slow. It's like chiseling out my territory over over almost 30 years. But I'm starting to have this territory that no one can take from you. I think it's almost like a war of attrition. People start looking at you going oh, that guy's just not going to stop. Let him have that space. It's almost like being a squatter. You just squat in that building until you whatever that that common law or whatever comes in, and you're you've stayed there long enough. You're entitled to renters' rights. So it's a trip, man. It's all strategy. It's I see people that have strategized much better than me. I've been impulsive and
by much better,
creative.
do you mean much more consciously?
Yes.
But that's not. There's also plenty of people that are really ambitious and strategize and it doesn't work out.
Yeah, that's true too.
That can come at a cost as well.
Well, yeah, there's the compromise. That's
Yeah.
the thing. They've had to sell something. And I have had that. I have had other artists who I don't want to name look at me in a certain way in conversation. And what they've said, much more successful artists, have basically implied...
What do you mean by successful? Just
commercially. Just money,
yeah.
crowd size,
Yeah.
record sales. Basically imply to me, you don't know what we've given up. Mm-hmm. Your career has a type of freedom that ours doesn't have. Mm-hmm. And I get that. I look at you look at these big touring artists like Dave Matthews or something, and they've got, it's like an entire company. It's like being a CEO where you're responsible for the roadies and their families, sure. And they only tour with you. So you've got to go out every year. And I do look at that and I go, there's not a lot of freedom in that.
Well, let's talk about a time when you felt like a failure.
Yeah.
So
many.
So what does it mean to you to feel like a failure? Or what did it mean at that point? Because I'm assuming that this trajectory that you've been on with the ups and downs has kind of redefined or refined your notion of success and failure. Well, So what did it originally like?
Yeah. Oh, rock stardom.
Okay. So
that was straight up Motley Crue. Did you ever see Uncensored, the Motley Crue home video?
No.
Okay, it was remember they used to make home videos of metal bands and stuff? And
On
it was
tour.
and you'd buy them in their hotels and everything. There was Vince Neil in a jacuzzi that was embedded in the back of a limo. Mm-hmm. So he's in a limo driving down Sunset in the back trunk, basically in a limo with two girls with no tops on. Mm-hmm. And he's got his arm around either of them and he's drinking champagne. I was like, that's it, man. That's it. Straight up. I'm not embarrassed to say like that was my driving probably image of, and even though it went into like indie and punk and stuff, it was still, there's still like sex, drugs and rock and roll. It's like, it's the dream. You know, I wanted to feel like the king of the world. I mean, that was the vibe.
And
it's a long way to fall, you know,
so
into
then
reality.
When you fell, how did it manifest? I mean, like what was your mindset? And then how did you proceed? Like, was there a time when you were like, oh, I guess I don't have a career anymore?
Yeah, there was times where I was like, well, maybe I should become like a music journalist or something. Like when like the magazines were still big, I was like, I could write for Spin or something like that. Yeah, you're just feeling like people aren't interested. I mean, it's funny because failure is not, it's not necessarily like I can't pay the rent or I can't, I don't know. For me, it was more just like, interest level. Like people were not interested in what I was doing. And also trends change. Like what I remember when the boy bands and everything came in, it suddenly became like indie, which had been so vibrant, suddenly like didn't matter anymore. Like, and it's funny how things cycle back, but like a band like Superchunk, you would just be like in 1999 or 98, you were just like, what place does this band have in culture? It seemed like they had a place, and now it was something totally different. And the cool stuff was like Björk, which was totally no guitars. It was like very uncool to be into rock or like acoustic music or anything like that. There was also no solo artists in indie music except for like me and Elliott Smith and Bright Eyes, kind of, which was sort of a band more too.
I toured with Mary Timony around that time, and she was having lots of the same issues.
Yeah, it's just not, it wasn't relevant. It was like you go from like the vibe around like being on the Beastie Boys label was like being at the apex of hip culture. And to forget fame and money and all that, but like feeling like you are where the party is.
Feeling like your voice is being heard and that you're relevant.
Your interests, they match up with a tribe. And there's, you know,
right.
To go from that to like kind of going, wow, culture has totally changed. Like they're not interested in the stuff I'm interested in anymore. And I remember trying, like I remember when Destiny's Child came out and like cool people were liking Destiny's Child.
Oh, I love Destiny's Child.
Well, I think I sort of like pretended to.
Yeah.
I've developed more courage now to say like I kind of don't really like that kind of music.
Yeah.
Like I respect, especially Beyonce. How can you not respect her as a performer and icon? I'm interested in them as icon. I like hip hop. Like I love Jay-Z. I used to listen to like a lot of hip hop. But as far as pop, like radio pop, I just didn't like it. And yet I felt that, and it's
you felt like an obligation to that you had to engage with it in some form to remain relevant.
But it's happened again now because indie has merged with pop music and radio music in a way that like the apex of success now is being asked to work with Ariana Grande or Lady Gaga in a way that, not to say I
or
would,
Beyonce. I mean, Beyonce
bringing in, you know, whatever,
the
Father John
Vampire
Misty,
Weekend.
Yeah. So like
Bon Iver.
And not to say I wouldn't be interested in what happened in those moments if I was given those opportunities. I do think it'd be interesting, but it's not what my passion is. So there are moments where you're more aligned with what's going on culturally. And I think for me...
And you have no control over that. That's one thing to realize.
Oh, that is about the weather and politics and,
you
know, and for me, I think pretty much those moments have had a painfulness to them. It's fun to feel like you're interested in things that in your interest, you share them with community. It's fun to feel that, but you can't. As an artist, there's times you're outside the tribe. They're character forming. You know, Mike Watt calls those gigs where no one there's character builders. You need character builders. And what I've kind of, now I feel totally differently. Now I feel like standing outside culture to a degree is actually the more powerful place to stand, because you're not subject to the whims of fashion and the way culture moves and what you have to do to be considered cool. But those moments have been really hard in the past. And then, you know what was even harder? That like, then I would actually often try and adapt. So like I made this record, Breathing Tornadoes, that came out on Capitol, that was my first really successful record in Australia. Like that record went platinum and had like, you know, big singles off it. But that was kind of like, you know, didn't have any real guitars on it for the most part. It was lots of loops. And this was 97, 7, something like that. And that was me going, okay, let me move with culture a little bit. I'm still going to make like weird songs with interesting lyrics that people wouldn't expect in a pop song and cool melodies, but let me try and do it within the vocabulary. Sure. And then what's interesting is you adapt, and then along comes Conor Oberst, who never changed and kept doing what he was doing, and you go, oh shit, I didn't realize it was an option just to keep doing it. So some people got that earlier, that you can stand in opposition to culture and continue to do your thing, and there's a very quiet power in that. And that lesson took me a lot of ups and downs to learn.
So where are you at right now?
About a year ago, I started thinking, I'm doing all these really fun things and great collaborations and getting to do cool work. But I was like, but where am I as a solo artist? That's been the thing I've been most of the time. And in LA, it's so wonderful. We get to participate in the industry of creation of stuff in so many ways. People don't even know these jobs that can exist. But I was like, well, where am I as a solo artist, as a guy that stands on stage? And I started thinking, I actually tweeted one night, I said, who are your favorite artists who made their best records after 40? I was just interested because I was like turning 40 at that point. And I started getting back this incredible list of artists. And it was PJ Harvey, Leonard Cohen, Willie Nelson, Lucinda Williams, Tom Waits, and thinking about these artists. And I made a playlist out of them. And I started looking at, you know what? These artists are all in my genre. They're singer-songwriters. I'm actually in a space where, if you're in the Strokes or if you're a hip-hop artist or something, the odds that you're going to make defining music in your 40s and 50s are that's a tough sell. Rock and roll, or like these are
something that's intermingled with youth culture.
Exactly. And I don't mean that to disparage that. I'm just saying
it'll happen. I mean, it will happen with hip hop because some of the luminaries are getting to that age.
That's right.
And they're going to make amazing statements.
And it's happened with rock. Like Aerosmith have done it, but they've done it by continuing to sing to 16-year-olds. The songs are always going to have that, like, I'm lusting after a hot chick.
Yeah, and it's kind of gross, actually.
Yeah, it feels a little weird.
And they would represent one of the extremes of the people that are very calculating with their career.
You get Diane Warren involved.
Yeah.
But I started thinking like, wow, the template is there if I choose to accept it of doing my best work in the next decade or two. And I started really thinking about that and opening up to it because in a way I had to release a level of disbelief or cynicism. It's almost like after heartbreak, you have to believe, like Cher said, do you believe in life after love?
Yeah.
You have to decide it's possible. And
there's another artist that, she made that when she was in her 50s, which is proof positive.
So I kind of just sort of went, you know what? I'm starting to believe it's possible. And then songs started coming. And I keep saying to people, I'm uttering the most untrustworthy words a songwriter could ever say, but I genuinely believe I'm writing the best shit of my life right now because I'm writing about where I'm at for people my age with a degree of mastery of my craft that I didn't have until this point. And I'm not singing to kids, I'm singing to grown-ups, and I'm writing about what it feels like to be eccentric and to be a musician and to be a parent and to believe in life and the imagination and psychedelics and all these things that like really where I stand and I'm very cautious about because I know every songwriter has to believe they're writing their best stuff, otherwise why would you even do it? You're just going through the motions.
Well, in the end, you're not the judge of that anyway.
No, or you're the only judge.
Or you can be. Yeah, but I mean it's a difficult thing to judge your own work. I mean, either it makes you feel something in the moment or it doesn't. When you're writing it.
But that's why what's been interesting is I've just started road testing the songs and seeing there is something happening with them. I did because I just put out a covers record and launched that at Largo and did 3 new songs and the song, they were the ones the audience came up and talked to me about after. So I was like, okay, I'm not insane. There's some vibrancy. Whether or not it will be as vibrant as I hope in terms of the energy around it is for history and life to determine.
And I think as soon as you figure out that is out of your control,
Yes.
the better
Totally out of my control. But what is in my control is, like we said in the beginning,
to show up.
and the degree of allowing myself to have ambition for it. That I think what happened when I started thinking about all these artists was I thought, before Lucinda Williams made Car Wheels on a Gravel Road.
Did she make that when she was in her 40s? Really?
She had to decide it was possible she was going to make a great record.
I would say that I think she wrote this song with her father called Compassion that came out like 7 years ago. I think it came out in 2012 or 2013. Anyway, I think that's one of the greatest songs written in that decade. I was thinking about it, and that was on an album called Where the Spirit Meets the Bone. Oh, awesome. It was a double album, and I got to see her perform it at Hotel Cafe. And I mean, there you go. And I saw Leonard Cohen that year too. And I mean, you can keep doing this until you die.
And you can deepen and you can get better. And that's the thing.
I would say that those two shows are among the greatest concerts I've ever seen. I think I cried at both of them. It was part of, a number of things that got me out of a very dark place. Yeah.
Yeah. So I reckon but in order for, I am a big believer that in order for sort of what we'd call magical things to happen, like these types of moments that are transcendent, you have to be open to the possibility of them happening. And so where I stand right now is I'm lit up. I feel creatively lit up, but grounded in the realities of what it is to be a musician. I'm not delusional. I'm not naive. I know the odds of work connecting involve so many out of control elements, but I believe in the possibility of it. Mm-hmm. And even on a small level, playing my songs for friends and family and hearing them, like, I've got this song that I've just finished writing. And the chorus is, sex and drugs and rock and roll work better now than back when I began. So kiss my lips and feed my soul. I came to hear the band. And I play that for people my age, and they're like, they smile and they go, yeah. They say, these are things that takes time to understand. Mm-hmm. But youth culture tells us you can understand it all at 16. You can't. You got to understand these things through living them.
Well, you can understand it on a certain level when you're 16,
That's right.
For sure.
That's right. I just perceive that there is work coming through me that there is an audience for, and I intend to deliver this music to them, and with gusto, and that's my vibe.
Well, this is coming at a great time. For me to hear this, because at 39, I'm about to release my first solo album after playing in dozens of bands and scoring hundreds of episodes of television and movies and stuff. And, it took me a long time to get to a point where I could believe that what I was saying would have any kind of resonance. And it's true. I mean, once I kind of was able to engage with the formidable negative voices in my head and quiet them, that's when things started happening.
Hell yeah, man. And I would even argue that on a larger scale, we actually have a problem on this planet because of people overvaluing youth energy in a certain way, that we don't listen to the wisdom of our elders. We don't listen to indigenous cultures. We don't respect nature enough. Like, there is something about a shift that is good for us if we start it's why there's so much talk about inclusivity in Hollywood, because we're recognizing that we need more diverse voices, and that includes age.
Oh, God. I mean, the majority of the most profound conversations I've had for this show are with people that are my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation. I mean, I spoke to a woman who was 105 when I interviewed her, and she's still alive. She's just going to have insight that a 21-year-old in the top band on the charts is not going to have. Or talking to, say, James Brown's drummers.
Totally.
I'm just going to get something out of that I could never get from somebody who might be extremely talented but hasn't lived that long.
It doesn't have to be a binary thing.
It's
like,
not.
There's room for all voices.
No.
But I think people like you and I saying, you know what? I'm kind of getting the confidence to share what it feels like to be in my 40s and feel what I feel and believe what I believe, that's good for culture.
Yeah.
You know, and so I'm like all for it.
Okay, boomer.
Exactly.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, man.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.